Hello, wonderful leader. This is Taka. Welcome to the Leadership in Africa Redefined, the podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Busara Africa, a Pan-African leadership development firm. In every episode of this podcast, we uncover powerful insights, share real-world experiences, and deliver practical strategies to help you excel as a leader. Subscribe to the show to become the leader you have always wanted to be. Enjoy! Welcome to another episode of Leadership in Africa Redefined, the podcast. So excited to join you all today. Thank you for joining us. Really excited as we have a special guest with us today. We have Bonolo Makgale. Did I get it right? No, let me do it one more time. Bonolo, I have to make sure I get it right. Bonolo Makgale. Better?
You got it right. Makgale.
Thank you, Bonolo. So for our listeners, our audience, Bonolo is a program manager of the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit at the Center for Human Rights, the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And she's also the convener of the Pan-African Parliament Civil Society Forum. She is passionate about human rights democratization in Africa, which I thought would be so key to have this conversation with her about what does leadership show up like around human rights and democratization in Africa. Her body of work through research and advocacy aims to close the democratic gap between AU organs, African Union organs, and African civil society by creating formal mechanisms of engagement for African civil society and the youth to critically and strategically engage with the African human rights and governance institutions. So Bonolo, you're so welcome. We've been trying to do this for a while, so I'm so excited that we finally made it happen. So how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Dr. Taka. How are you doing?
I'm good. And thank you so much for giving me that title of doctor, but I'm not a doctor. But thank you anyway.
Oh, I assumed you are. I'm prophesying.
Thank you. I receive it. So Bonolo, maybe a good place to start is tell us a little bit about your journey, your career and leadership journey.
Well, I grew up in a very small village in the northwest part of South Africa, in Rustenburg. And I think my leadership journey, to be honest, started at the age of 14 years. And I'm not sure if this is a good story to tell or a bad story to tell, but it depends on who's listening. Because from 14 years old, I started preaching. And I used to be, then I preached, and then, I stopped preaching about 6 or 7 years ago, conversation for another day. And then I was in student leadership, and I then went and even my academic journey, I moved from having studied political science to public theology to development studies to public policy. So I've literally seen my life move from different disciplines of life to where I am. I always say to people, I'm the queen of rebranding. I will rebrand any opportunity I get. From the work I do currently and the work I've done, having been in civil society and academia, but also I think being part of the church at that very early age and being active in church leadership kind of shaped me in a particular way, in terms of how I see the world around me and how I see humanity, but also how I want to apply myself as a leader, one that really makes an effort to lead with compassion, with kindness.
Apologies, there was a pause there. Folks, bear with us. We're struggling with internet today, but hopefully you'll be able to hear us clearly. Okay. So I love this, Bonolo. So the rebranding, I love the way that your journey it hasn't been a straight one. It has taken many curves but I'm imagining that many of your experiences you've brought into where what you're passionate about today. Huh? So as somebody who is working
Mhm.
very much around democracy and civic engagement, huh? What brought about
Mhm.
your passion in that?
So, it was an interesting thing. And I keep saying this that I think from a very early age, I kind of had an idea, even though I didn't have the vocabulary. I had an idea that I wanted to do work specifically around development, politics, and democracy, and be part of a people that would be change makers on the continent. But at the time, I mean, having grown up, I always joke that having grown up in the village where I was taught English in Setswana and going to varsity and having to figure out how to write assignments in English, right? But there was always a thing that inherently I knew what I wanted to do. And I
Mm.
knew what I was passionate about, and I may not have had the vocabulary at the time. And so through my academic journey and through my professional journey, this thing started evolving into something that makes sense, something that I could name, right? And so if one were to ask me, what is it that I'm very passionate about with so much conviction, I would say I'm very passionate about democratization in Africa. And I'm very passionate about ensuring that we as a collective reimagine an Africa that looks different from our current reality. And whatever that looks like, whether we do that through research, whether we do that through advocacy, whether we do that through dialogue, and conversations like this, there's a sense of clarity and conviction that this is what I want to do. And I don't think this started 7 years ago or 10 years ago. I think this has always been there since I was a kid. I may not have had the vocabulary that I have now. Now I'm able to name it.
Love this. I love this. What I'm hearing from you is a leader who's always been purpose driven, huh? With that, even though you didn't have the name for it, it's been that sense of clarity that democratization in Africa has been that difference you want to make, or that area in which you want to make a difference. Huh? So let us come to that topic of democratization in Africa, and then we'll start to connect it to what leadership is required to see increased levels of democratization on this continent. Huh? But maybe I'll start with a broad question in terms of what are some of the general trends you are seeing around democratization? Huh? When we hear and read the news, often what we see, listen to, and read is not positive. Huh? From whether we're looking at Sudan, or whether we're looking at when this recording is taking place. Yesterday, we were hearing about protesters who were killed in Kenya, young people
Yeah.
protesting and asking for increased democratization in Kenya. When you come closer to home, where I'm joining you from in Accra, we start to think about what's happening in the Sahel. But even I jumped over the DRC, sorry, yeah, and what's happening there too. So,
Yeah.
so Bonolo, tell me, how would you describe the general trends you are seeing on the
Mhm.
continent around democratization? I've said the bad news. Is that all there is around democratization?
And I like that you say that is that all there is about democratization in Africa. And I think it's important to start here by saying that I think that democracy remains the most legitimate form of governance. Because what it does is that it provides us with, the only sustainable mechanism of, of peaceful power transitions, of accountability and representation. And so what democracy offers us, it kind of gives us this idea and emphasizes this idea of contestation and participation, shows us that democracy is actually not perfect. And what we are seeing, the trends that we are seeing around the world, it actually points to the fact that democracy lies not in perfection, but in its capacity to self correct, to to answer your question more specifically, I think one we've got, the what I would call the governance paradox. For example, you mentioned the Sahel. What we are witnessing in the Sahel, I'm not sure, and I say this not based on any empirical evidence, but I'm not sure that it's specifically the rejection of democracy as a concept. And Sahel is not an exception here. I don't think what we are seeing happening on the continent, it's a rejection of democracy as a concept, but rather a desperate response of the failure of democratic practice. And so what we then are seeing specifically in the Sahel and in the West African Francophone is that, the celebration of the military coup, for example, by young people. You remember when young people in Mali, occupied the streets of Mali celebrating the military takeover. I think it reflects a democratic disillusionment and a political dissatisfaction, specifically when democratic institutions exist but fail to deliver democratic dividends like economic opportunities, security, justice, and responsive governance. And so this thing that we are seeing where there seems to be a leadership crisis where the core issue of here is the democratic recession where democratic forms persist, but democratic substance erodes through corruption. That we see African leaders being very corrupt, things around elite capture, things around institutional decay, where really African leaders keep talking and emphasizing this idea of democracy as a procedural exercise to say, but we've contacted elections. But were those elections free and fair? That's a different conversation, right? And so they'll talk about, but we've contacted elections and so on and so on. But what we are seeing is that the procedural exercise of democracy does not bring transformative governance. And so what we're seeing is it's people pushing back because they are saying procedure. I mean, let me make an example about South Africa. South Africa has been rated to have the best formal democracy in Africa. So the procedural exercise of democracy in South Africa is something that can be questioned, right? Where our institutions are performing very relatively well. The judiciary has an independence. We've got the independent electoral commission and so on and so forth. But the quality of democracy as it's experienced by citizens tells a different story. Where South Africa is now, has been one of the most unequal states in the world, where the rate of unemployment has grown in the most concerning way, where we've got constant issues of gender-based violence, where we've got people living below the poverty line. And of course, South Africa is not an exception, even in other parts of this continent. And so we're seeing this tension where people aren't experiencing and enjoying the dividends of democracy alongside procedural democracy and formal democracy that doesn't really translate to anything.
It's so interesting. I have 1,000,000,001 questions because what you're saying, thank you so much, Bonolo, so deeply resonates. Huh? And as you talk about the failure of democratic practice, particularly looking at procedural exercise of democracy, it seems so much of the focus seems to be around elections. So my question for you is, if indeed we're not seeing the democratic dividends in terms of translating into increased quality of life, enjoyment of human rights of all the population, not just a few, what needs to change in the social contract between leaders and citizens in terms of how we hold them accountable in between elections? What are you finding works or doesn't work?
I think one of the things that we are struggling with again is also this idea that we place democracy only on elections and on the act of voting. And so there's a cycle where after every 4 years, we go to the polls, we vote, and then there aren't questions around our political systems, in terms of how do we ensure that our political systems are political systems that center representation of marginalized groups, for an example, that centers participation of African citizens, and not just in a tokenism way, where you'll hear things like, "Yeah, we've done consultation on that particular policy," but the question is, what was the conversation that was had during that consultation? There's a joke, that an ongoing joke here in South Africa, that when they say consultation, they just meant that they went to a community and bought cold drink and bread and then went and made people sign registers that we consulted, right? So there seems to be a disconnect in meaningful participation of citizens in public affairs. But I think more importantly, after the elections, it's this idea of how power is exercised after elections. Because the way in which power is exercised after elections is that the representatives that we have voted for, after we've given them the mandate to ensure that to the democracy conversation I was speaking about, to ensure that they fulfill some of the promises that they made, basic needs. We shouldn't be having conversations about lack of water and sanitation. We shouldn't be having conversations about children going to bed hungry, and we see that happen. We shouldn't be having conversation about the working poor, particularly, again, I'll keep making examples about South Africa, where even the spatial arrangement in South Africa and transport provision in South Africa continues to marginalize a particular demographic of people, where you see Black women working in the economic hubs and in the city center by traveling from Soweto, for an example. When I used to work at Wits University, the lady that used to clean our office used to say she leaves her house at 4:30 a.m. so that she can catch a 5 a.m. bus so that she can get to Wits University at 6:30. Because if she catches the later bus, she will arrive at work late, and she still leaves work very late in the day and gets home. When does she become a mother? When does she become a wife? When does she, and there's another layer here of unpaid domestic labor and the burden of Black women. And we shouldn't be having conversations like this at this point of our democracy, right? And I think part of it is this idea of how power is exercised, that we've given the mandate to you, and they really don't care in terms of ensuring that the mandate we've granted to them when we went to the ballot to vote for them, that they fulfill that mandate. And so I think we need to think critically about what we want, what kind of governance we want to see, what kind of political systems we want to see, and how do we want to see power exercise after elections. Because if we are going to center this conversation only on elections, we're going to have the kind of problems that we're having, and the military will come and say, "Hey, I'm the alternative," and we know very well that the military is not an alternative, and it shouldn't be an alternative. Primary mandate of the military is not to govern. The primary mandate of the military is to provide security. But what we are seeing now is the desperation of Africans that have been failed by their governments, and the military then capitalizing on that, and taking over and claiming to be an alternative. And we know very well that they are not a better alternative. Look at Uganda.
Thank you very much. So, but I want to take you back, because I really like where the conversation is going in terms of recognizing. So it can't just be about elections. Beyond elections, really looking at what is the quality of participation of citizens in public affairs, looking at how power is being exercised. So my next question then, particularly in terms of around how power is being exercised, what examples have you seen around the continent where either there have been strong enough institutions, whether it's parliament or the judiciary or other oversight bodies, to hold, particularly the executive, accountable on how power is exercised. And you mentioned, from corruption to elite capture. What are the good examples that we can see of that? And two, what are interesting examples of, going back to your first point, where we can increasingly see citizens participating in the formulation, the design, not just of policy, but particularly how policy is implemented. Because I think for many of our governments, where we have PhDs in wonderful, nice policies on paper, but implementation just it doesn't actually occur. So what have you seen that we can learn from?
That's a very difficult question to answer because also I struggle with this idea of sitting in or lamenting at all times, right? Because two things can be true at the same time, where we lament and we are hopeful. But the story of Africa, in most cases, it's very difficult to find stuff to celebrate.
Ah,
And so
around
it is a
governance,
very
huh?
difficult thing
Particularly in governance.
around
Yeah,
governance,
yeah.
particularly around governance. So we've seen cases, for an example, in South Africa, we've seen cases where there'd be commission of inquiries when there are these corruption issues, right? But what we also see is the state spending a lot of money on this commission of inquiries, and people are then literally not held accountable if the reports point out that there has been corruption. I mean, like I said, in South Africa, relatively, we see where Parliament and the judiciary really make sure that we hold the executive to account. And I also don't want to build a case where I make South Africa look like it's all glorious and all of that, because it's not. And so to make specific examples of, good cases of where accountability has been exercised, it's very difficult. But I've also been seeing a little bit of a trend where, on the one hand, governments have this weird relationship with civil society organizations
Hmm?
because civil society organizations provide another layer of oversight. But
Yes.
we're also seeing another part of it where governments are also, to some degree, receptive to civil society. So it's like on the one hand, they're like, in theology, I think they call it the hermeneutics of suspicion, where they look at you with some sort of suspicion. You are an enemy of the state, and all of that. But then you'll see that there are other really human rights bodies and government institutions that actually say, how about we bring civil society on board to kind of help us, fix our governance systems, And so, but be that as it may, we can also agree that even globally, specifically here in Africa, where the shrinking of civil society is growing significantly. Governments have become even very creative to use laws to infringe on the right to freedom of association and assembly. And so it's a two-way thing, right? So on the one hand, there's the suspicion when it comes to civil society, but on the other, there are those little efforts where we can see that civil society has done significant work on this continent of holding states accountable, taking governments even to court. For example, the Center for Human Rights, as an example, recently won a case against the government of Tanzania, where they took the government of Tanzania to the African Court on Human and People's Rights on a matter of persons with albinism in particular, right? And I think that's something to kind of highlight, to say these efforts that we are making, it's hard, but sometimes we we see hope. And I keep saying that I'm hoping that in the next 30 years, a generation after me will tell a different story. And that's why I do the work that I do in engaging with African Union, in engaging with governments, to say, let's figure out a new Africa. And then in terms of answering your question around increasingly ensuring that there's citizens' participation, I think we also need to recognize that the law, and my lawyer friends always struggle when I say this, that the law and legal framing will not change the problems of this world. Because constitutionally, or the law alone, let me qualify that, the law legal framework alone will not change the challenges of this world. If you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union in particular, speaks to this idea of African citizens participating in matters of the African Union, African citizens being part of decision-making processes of the African Union. But even at that, there's a provision in the Constitutive Act. And I think most constitutions on the continent as well speaks to things around citizens' participation, civic engagement and whatnot. But what that looks like in practice, it's a completely different story. And so again, it goes back to the point I made earlier that once we get to a point where we realize that the different sectors, non-state actors and state actors, if we actually came and worked together, and really, really prioritize not just participation, but meaningful participation. I think that in many ways would help us. Because then if that doesn't happen, we'll have cases of what we saw in Kenya last year, where young people then were rejecting the finance bill because, again, I would imagine then there was no process of proper consultation where young people could actually say, no, actually, we don't like this finance bill. And the only way they know how to respond to that is by protest, because whether we want to accept it or not, it looks like that's the only way that gets the attention of governments. And so, yeah, I think it's this tension of ensuring that far beyond the legal frameworks, it's not just a procedural right, but it's a substantive right. And it becomes a substantive right when governments recognize that African citizens must be consulted in governance matters and public affairs matters.
As a leader, making decisions and solving problems can sometimes feel overwhelming. Having a thinking partner to help you reflect, gain clarity, and take charge of your situation is essential for personal and professional growth. This is where coaching comes in. At Busara Africa, we offer executive coaching guided by the ethics of the International Coaching Federation. Our internationally certified coaches bring years of experience and mastery of the coaching process, empowering you to take control of your leadership journey. Contact us today at www.busara-africa.com.
Are you doing too much? Feeling overwhelmed, yet still questioning if you're doing enough? Leading from within, the inner work of leadership is here to help. This monthly online program helps leaders like you build self-awareness, master emotional intelligence, and lead with confidence. With expert-led masterclasses, practical tools, and a curated resource library, you'll gain insights to lead with authenticity and impact on your schedule. So take a breath and join me on a powerful journey of inner work required to thrive and find your joy as a leader. Join now on www.busara-africa.com. And thank you so much for really emphasizing and bringing so clearly to light the role of civil society in terms of holding government accountable, and talking and really also emphasizing how much civil society has done in that respect, even in the context of shrinking civic space. So the question that comes to mind then, particularly now coming back to this issue of leadership, and wondering what is the type of leadership that's needed? And I'll ask you about the type of leadership that's needed in two areas. One, because you talked about the African Union, I want to come to the African Union because there've been so, for many who don't work closely with the African Union and don't work as closely as maybe you do, they might be wondering, now what is the purpose of this continental body? What is the purpose of the other regional bodies, SADC, ECOWAS? Truly, how are they impacting my life? Huh? So, what is the kind of leadership increasingly we need to see in these continental and regional bodies to really improve the quality of governance and democratization on this continent? Huh? And then, in fact, let me stop there before I go on further. I don't like to compound questions. Let's just start with that one.
The issue of African leadership is really one that is very close to my heart and quite concerning. And I was having a conversation with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and she said something that perhaps we must disabuse ourselves from the expectation that our current leadership cares. Do you know how painful that is? That's very painful.
That is.
And so I think we need a different kind of leadership. And I'm intentionally not going to use theoretical and academic language here. I'm going to use soft language for a reason. I really think that we need leaders who center humanity and the needs of those that they're leading. At the moment, the kind of leadership that we have is very self-seeking. The kind of leadership that we have is one that prioritizes what they can gain out of it. And I don't know what will get us to that point. I'm not sure. I wish I had the answers. I'm not sure whether, because it for some strange reasons, it almost feels like politics in its design and political leadership in its design is very selfish.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Systemic, isn't
And
it,
so,
Bonolo? It's so deeply
yeah,
systemic. So then I wonder,
yes.
because it's systemic, huh? It's almost like the rules of the game are very egotistical, very self-centered. You go there to make money. And we've seen people, I'm sure you've seen it again, now coming back to the broad issue of governance, people who want to make a difference, or maybe even coming from civil society, who get co-opted into the system, but once they get into the system, then it all turns topsy-turvy. So then I start to wonder, how do we start to change the system? The politics, this is what you were mentioning. How do we change the political system so that it incentivizes those who are already purpose-driven leaders such as yourself, to step into spaces like that, and be, how can I say, and for the system to constantly continue to incentivize them to be people-oriented, to be human-centered, to be participatory, to be transformative. I interrupted you, sorry.
Look, I think we have a problem of weak state capacity largely. And as I mentioned earlier, not just weak state capacity, but also an issue of service delivery failures, right? And before I get to this point, sorry, I just want to go back to a comment you made where we saw a trend in Zambia specifically where people that were working in civil society organizations have been captured by the current regime, where you see members of civil society that used to speak very strongly about the promotion of human rights and democracy and holding states accountable, suddenly being given very prominent positions in government. For Ghana in particular, I was in Ghana last year and I was having a conversation with students from the University of Ghana, and we were talking about student movements on campus. And one of the students said it's very difficult to organize student movements that are non-partisan, because what we then see is that political parties infiltrate those movements that started well. They get into those movements and then, capture, for a lack of a better word, capture these young people that want to make change. And I think we need people that are strong in their conviction. I always say to people, me, I like finer things in life, but I'm also very much committed to this continent. And so the fact that I do the work that I do and don't have enough money to enjoy the finer things in life should tell you something. Because if I didn't have a conviction about the work that I do, I wouldn't be working where I work now, right? And I think we also need, the same way we call for a leadership that prioritizes the people that it's leading, I think we also need to not take for granted the fact that even those of us that are not operating from state institutions but are operating from non-state institutions, even us need to be held accountable. Even us need to keep ourselves in check, to make sure that we remain fulfilling the mandate we want to fulfill. But I want to go back to the point I made about weak state capacity. I think the idea of democratic legitimacy, in particular, in ways in which states are performing, um, requires ensuring that we strengthen the capacity of state. And if I go back to the work that we do specifically at the Center for Human Rights and the work that I do with the organs of the African Union that are here in Midrand, more specifically the Pan-African Parliament, is to really work around things around strengthening institutional capacity, right? Ensuring that states actually are able to fulfill mandates that have been granted to them. And so this idea of the ability to deliver basic service delivery effectively by states across Africa, the idea of ensuring that we don't have weak administrative systems. We spoke about elections earlier. What we are that we've got badly managed elections, then it provides a very fertile ground for elections to not be free and fair, right? We need things around, adequate infrastructure, even this idea that the government, as I mentioned earlier, does not they work so hard to ensure that, or rather, government must work so hard, because what we are currently seeing is that there seems to be a trust deficit where citizens do not now have confidence in states. So strengthening institutions, and strengthening state capacity, but also ensuring that there's adequate infrastructures. We ensure that we work through these really weak administrative systems. But I also think that we need to think about elite capture, and politics now. It seems like an elite space, where a particular group of people get to benefit from the resources of the state, right? And so we need to think about ways in which a certain group of people does not have access to state resources only. A certain group of people that has power as well does not use its resources to capture the independence and autonomy of state. I mean, we saw that in South Africa with the state capture you would know about, and how the Gupta family literally, captured the state because they have those resources. But we can do that if we really put systems in place that have very strong accountability mechanisms, that have very strong transparency efforts, that have very strong engagement with citizens that would be able to put you under public scrutiny.
Really interesting. And I'm glad you came to this point in terms of dealing with weak state capacity. We had another guest on, and we were talking about the vestiges of colonialism in African governments. And we talked about weak state capacity as being one of those. And listening to you, I'm taking away two things that we would need to see in terms of the leadership we want. One is leaders who can grow and know how to develop strong public institutions, strong state institutions, but institutions that can outlast them. So it's not just about them and the personalities. Institutions that can deliver critical services, particularly to those who are most marginalized. I think many of us elites can find alternatives, but really to the most vulnerable and marginalized. But also strong institutions that have, as you call it, almost like strong admin systems and processes that really work. And that know-how is not something you find anywhere, but I'm hearing clearly that that's if our governance is to work, if our democratization is to work, we need leaders who have first that capability. Yeah? Even before then, by the way, no, you said something else. You said leaders who have strong conviction, who are able to navigate and stay strong in the context of a political system that's often pulling them in different directions. So maybe that's the first one, strong conviction. And the second one is this capacity to build strong public institutions. But the third one, which I want to check with you if this is really doable, is leaders who are able to navigate and resist elite capture because they're immunized from it, maybe by independent, because I almost think what pulls people in terms of elite capture, if that's where your money came from to campaign, if you still need to think of more money, you are very vulnerable for people to come back again and then co-opt you into there, yeah? But if you have a certain degree of autonomy and independence, because your base, your source of power is not coming from those resources, then I wonder if we need leaders who are better able to be immunized from that. And then they're the ones who can create more transparent systems, more. Again, I'm thinking aloud. You've got me thinking, but what is the type of leadership that we need? I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly on the second. How do we support leaders to be better protected when they have the conviction from elite capture?
Look, I think, let me make an example about foreign aid. And I make this example to draw a point. If you think about foreign aid, and I think whether we want to accept it or not, I mean, there are two school of thoughts here where people are saying Africa actually has resources, we don't need foreign aid. But there's also a school of thought that says we actually do need foreign aid. And it could be even, some people would argue reparation, but that's a completely different conversation. But I think in the foreign aid conversation, there's this idea of aid conditionality. And the aid conditionality speaks to influence on how the politics of the country look like, but in terms of how policy looks like. And then there's this also idea to that, the idea of knowing who holds the power behind the throne. And I think that's where we have a problem. The one who holds the power behind the throne. And so then the question is, because also I don't think this is just about money, because you could also have leaders who have money, and still don't care. You know, so we shouldn't make it about money, but also we must not take away the value and the power of money in politics and governance, right? And so I don't know the simplest answer to this and ways in which we can figure this out. But I think in the negotiation processes, I think there has to be a constant effort to say, so let me make an example about us in civil society. We get money from donors, right? And we sell the idea as strategic partnerships. And there are donors that get it, and there are donors that don't get it. There are donors that will remind us that it is their money, and because it is their money, they completely influence how we do the work that we do. And I think that's very difficult, where even in some cases where you really are just uncomfortable with this power dynamic because one has brought, the capital that you require to do the work that you do. But then there are other donors who really see the value and the power of philanthropy, the power of partnerships. And so they see us not as grantees, but they see us actually as strategic partners, and completely leaves us with our autonomy and independence in ways in which we do our affairs, as long as we report on their money and report honorably and are good stewards of their money. And I wonder if this is a model that could be used as well in African politics. I'm not sure. Maybe that's
I
something.
love the idea, but I am so glad you brought the analogy, because to me it's getting to the heart of what is the source of your power. Huh? If
Yeah.
your power is grounded in, okay, what's your power? Your power to do as a leader, as an NGO, if your power to do is coming from a particular donor, you'll feel like you're beholden to that particular donor unless they're enlightened enough to say, we trust you, go ahead. Huh? Now, given in our governance, those who are giving you that money and all those other resources, I'm not hopeful that they will be as enlightened as some other donors. But if your base as a political leader is indeed, if your base, your source of power is the people, your constituency, those who voted for you, then I wonder if the power dynamics start to shift. But yeah, I think there's a lot more we need to think through in terms of how money flows, the social contract around who is actually voting, what you exchange in return for the vote. How people engage in between elections. I think it's a conversation that we need to continue to have, but also maybe have more openly around what is this leadership and who is going into politics, who are our public sector leaders, and how can we create a system that enables them to be the leaders that Africa needs and deserves. Bonolo, I could talk to you forever about this, and we could go in so many different directions. Any final thoughts or words around the leadership Africa needs for us to realize the democratic dividends that we so hope for?
Look, I think let me reflect on an old African proverb. I think it says something to the effect that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And I think that every democracy we strengthen, every right we defend, every young leader we develop, these are the trees we are planting for future generations. And the question isn't whether Africa will get there. The question is whether we'll plant the trees today. And so, and I said to you earlier that two things can be true at the same time, where we can lament, we can be hopeful, and we can build. And so even while we have lamented about the state of democracy in the world, specifically in Africa, while we have lamented about the constant human rights violations, the shrinking of civic space, the inequalities, the poverty, the disillusionment of young people, the political dissatisfaction, the bad leadership. I think the tree of democracy, this conversation, it is part of us planting the tree of democracy. And let's continue planting.
Oh,
Let's
I love
lament.
this.
Plant.
I love that. Thank you so much. What a powerful way to end. Recognizing that this conversation, as we muddled through, tried to figure out alternative ways of being in terms of our democracy, is us planting that tree. So our cherished audience, listeners, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss other shows. Take care. Ciao. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Leadership in Africa Redefined, the podcast. I hope you learned a lot. And if you found value in this conversation, share it with a friend and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you would like further support on your leadership journey, please get in touch. You can find us on busara-africa.com. And don't forget to follow Busara Africa on all social media platforms.